Uh, we are here to witness and mark a very important occasion. The UNEP has come out with its emissions gap report. It's a report which comes out every year, and as you know, you might be knowing, the report is slightly different from the other reports that talk about climate change and climate science. It's not exactly modeled on the pattern of the IPCC reports. It's it's a report that sits between science and policy. I would expect UNEP to talk more about it, but the background is that this emissions report is extremely important, and this year is particularly very important, the year in which it has come out. This has a lot of information that will feed into the climate change policy making negotiating process, which will be there in 2020. So 2020 is a very critical year. We are just a year ahead of that. Before 2020, when the entire climate discourse is centered around what we can do to go further policy action to reach the 2-degree goal and the 1.5-degree goal. To discuss this, I have a very eminent panel here with me. Fortunately, there are very important think tanks which have joined together on this occasion, and they have agreed to share this panel. Dr. Nowroz Dubash, you are familiar with. He represents the Center for Policy Research. Dr. P.K. Anand, he is from the RIS. I represent, of course, TERI. Dr. Simon Maxwell, he is from the he has been with the government of Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex earlier, but for a long time he was with the government of the UK, and he has been a development economist. So I introduce him later when we start talking about this. But these three institutions have come together, and fortunately we have received the support of the UNEP for discussing this study, which has just come out. So without spending more time on, because I don't have the full details of the report at this moment, Dr. Maxwell will talk more about it when he makes his presentation. So in this discussion today, all the panel, and Mr. Sabyasachi Saha, I forgot to introduce him because he also represents RIS. So the structure is like this. I'll request Dr. Maxwell to make a presentation on what the report talks about. What is it that the report says about the current state of climate? What is the gap in the emissions efforts by different countries and the ambition level? And what are the other implications of this report for the climate discourse? RIS, represented by the two eminent panelists here, I'll request them to talk about the linkages between the climate and the development, which is their forte, and I'm sure we will get to learn about how the policy in the development space will play out in the background of climate change after we hear the two panelists. Dr. Dubash, you are familiar with him. He is an eminent economist at the Center for Policy Research. He has made extremely important contributions to understanding the climate science, both at the global level and in India. Both Dr. Dubash and Dr. Maxwell are part of the steering group which has looked at the report. They are not the authors of the report, but they have made very important contribution to the report, in the sense that they have given it a proper shape. They have looked at its findings, And I'm sure when they talk about it, they will share their experience about how they have gone about this process. So let me begin with Dr. Simon Maxwell. He has, to his credit, for the last 50 years or so, he has studied and analyzed and worked on the area, the different facets of economics and relationship with climate change. He has been with UNDP and then with the Institute of Development Studies. He was also, for a number of years, he was, I think about 11 years or more, the director of the Overseas Development Institute. And recently he has been the executive chair of the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, chair of the European think tank groups, and a specialist advisor to the International Development Select Committee of the US House of Commons. Currently he's the past president of Development Studies Association of the UK and Ireland, and he has also been conferred with CBE for his services. So, Dr. Maxwell,
thank you very much.
I look forward to your presentation on the report.
When you get to my age, it takes 20 minutes to read out the CV, so thank you very much. I'm going to go there, shall I, because I need the PowerPoint. Well, it's an honour to be with such a distinguished group, both on the panel and in the room.
Is there a presentation? Or you can turn the chairs?
I'm going to make 12 points in 15 minutes. So you have to hang on to your hats because I'm going to go really quickly. I need to start by saying I don't represent UN Environment, whose report we're talking about. I don't represent the British government, and so take that in your strides. If I mention India, it will be by accident because I don't want to say anything about India in this company. But if you want to know about climate change and development in India, of course you read the book that Navroz Dubash has edited, which is available in all good bookshops. And the secret is it's also free online, so you don't have to pay for it. I'm going to say 7 things about the emissions gap report and then 5 things which are on my own account about this topic. So to start with the emissions gap report, which came out of embargo this morning and was launched in Geneva, I've summarised the key messages in 7 points, which you won't be able to read and I can't read either, so I've broken them down and we can look at them one by one. The first is, we're not winning the battle. Emissions should be falling in the world, and they're not. They're still going up. They've gone up by 1.5% per year during the last decade, and they reached 55.7 gigatons in 2018. And you'll have seen the report from the World Meteorological Association in the paper yesterday that the carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are now well over 400 parts. But we used to be told, 400 parts per million, that's going to be the really dangerous point. We're now at 40, 409, 410, 411. And here's a graph to illustrate that. 2 or 3 years ago, we used to say, we're doing fine because actually the emissions have begun to stabilize. And if you look at this period here, the emissions of carbon, of CO2 particularly, have begun to stabilize. That's now reversed, and the emissions are going up again. And of course, that's extremely worrying given what we know about the need to accelerate progress. And why is that? And these are all graphs from the emissions gap report. We're making progress on energy intensity in developed countries and in developing countries. But the effect of that improvement in energy efficiency and so on is being overwhelmed by the growth of GDP and also GDP per capita, which is an issue I'll come back to. So that's why we're beginning to lose the battle, because GDP is growing faster than energy intensity is reducing. So that's my first point. It's time to take this issue even more seriously than before. It's time, not to panic, but to act. Now, what's interesting about this is that, of course, national emissions have risen faster in developing countries, and especially in China, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. But a lot of that is actually hidden in exports from those countries. So China, big manufacturing country, emits because it's producing stuff that other people are buying. And so we talk all the time in the climate negotiations about national emissions, But it's interesting also to look at what's happening to of the footprint of countries. Here's a picture on the left is the total emissions from different countries, and you can see how China has rocketed up to be by far the biggest emitter in the world. I'm not talking about India, but India is on that chart, not rocketing exactly, but growing steadily. And on the right-hand side, you see the emissions per capita, where China is now producing emissions at roughly the same level as the European Union. What's interesting, of course, I'm not talking about India, but it's interesting to see where India is and to ask what India's future trajectory might be. And then this graph, again from the report, illustrates the difference between the national emissions and the footprint. So look at China. The black line at the top is what they emit, and that's what they report to the climate negotiations. But the dotted line underneath is their footprint. So the difference between the two, of course, is net exports. And for developing countries, especially industrializing emerging economies, it tends to be the case that their national emissions are greater than their footprint. For richer countries, the opposite is the case. And I will show you a graph later of the UK which illustrates that point very well. This has big implications for how the negotiations are conducted, but also for how countries are held accountable for their contribution to global warming. Now, how are we doing in terms of the pledges people are making? And for 2020, the G20 as a whole, taken in aggregate, is on track to meet the pledges they made in Cancun. But as many as 7 countries are not for 2020. Canada, Indonesia, Mexico, Republic of Korea, South Africa, and the US. I think it's good to name names in this kind of report, and the UN Environment has been good at doing that. Some of the ones that have met their commitments have done so because they had very unambitious commitments to start with. And I won't name names on that issue, but some of them made commitments that were even above what they were currently producing at the time. For 2030, the situation is even more serious. 6 countries are on track, but 7 require further action: Australia, Brazil, Canada, Japan, Republic of Korea, South Africa, and the US. And 2030 for this report and for the climate change is a big topic. So we have to be careful next year that we don't get lots of commitments from countries to enhanced ambition which don't get translated into action. And then we come to the heart of the emissions gap report. The gap is huge. And actually we spend a lot of time, Navroz and I and others, talking about how to present this in ways that are understandable to anybody who is not a climate scientist, which includes me anyway, because it's complicated. And this graph shows you how complicated it is. And I'm going to walk over here to point at the graph. A couple of things that are worth saying about this. I'm not very interested in this one, but this one shows you where we will be on current policies, and the answer is about 59-60 gigatons. If you talk to a non-specialist audience, one of the exciting questions is, what is a gigaton? Very hard to explain, but anyway, it's a lot, of course. How much did the NDCs contribute, the country commitments contribute? That much for unconditional and conditional. And what do we need? And the answer is we need to be all the way down here for 2 degrees and all the way down here for 1.5 degrees. And the key takeaway lesson from this, of course, is that the gaps are big, but that the NDCs actually only contributed a very small part of what needed to happen. We knew this figure certainly in 2015 in Paris, and we probably knew this figure as well. Add up all the NDCs, and it's a bottom-up process in which each country says what it plans to do. We managed about 30% of what is needed to reach 2 degrees, and we managed much less than that for 1.5 degrees. Most of the heavy lifting has to be done still and has not yet been delivered, and that's why, as the chair said, 2020 is so important. And then finally, I think from EGR 2019, the later you leave it, the harder it gets. And the first emissions gap report was in 2010, and we calculated what the path would be to achieve a transition and so on. And we could have got away with 0.7% reduction a year. Now, in order to get to the same target in 2030, we need 2 degrees, And the headline in the press release that the EGR has issued this morning, that the UNEP has issued this morning, is that to get to 1.5 degrees, we need a 7% reduction each year. The world record for reductions, pretty well, I think, is held by the UK, partly because Mrs. Thatcher closed all the coal mines. We managed about 2.4%, I think, over the course of the period 1990 to 2018. So we managed, as a world record, one country, 2.4%. The whole world needs to do over 2 degrees, 3 degrees, in fact, and if we want to get to 1.5, we need 7 degrees. And I think you can draw your own conclusions about the scale that's needed and the amount of structural reform that will be needed by every country. So that's my very brief summary of what's in EGR. Let me add a few more things on my own account in the last few minutes, Chair, if I may.
Yeah.
There are another 5 points, and I'll take a minute on each. First of all, the modelling is a black box, as far as I'm concerned, that gives us the least cost pathway. But the one thing I do know about it is that the integrated assessment models that are used in the modelling do not take account of extreme weather events. And if you know how serious droughts, floods, hurricanes, and all the rest are, and this is the World Meteorological Organization annual report, we all know, we only have to see the papers, that these are extreme weather events are increasing in frequency and intensity. If you add those into the equation, there's much more to do even than we saw on the previous slide. So that's point one. Point two, here's an interesting challenge for developing countries, because many developing countries have said, you know, this is a historic problem, the developed countries are responsible, but we developing countries need to deliver development for our people, so we need our emissions to grow, because that is the only way we're going to succeed. Well, yes, but remember this graph I showed, and remember the scale of the global challenge. So if developing countries are going to increase their emissions, that means that developed countries have to reduce even more than the frankly inconceivable rates that I indicated earlier. You know, if we manage 2.4 in the UK and we need to manage 7 globally, and countries that are developing want to grow their emissions, how much more do developed countries have to cut in order to be able to keep global warming to 1.5 or well below 2 or 2 degrees? This is a very serious issue, which of course, because it's difficult and it's diplomatic and it's contentious, is never discussed really in the UNFCCC negotiations, because everything is bottom up and reliant on what countries decide they can contribute. But we, as independents, as analysts, have to look at the total picture, I think, and ask these very difficult questions. If you start to look at the footprint, and I showed you the gap between the national emissions and the footprint early on, and you realise how big the footprint is, then what comes very strongly into focus is lifestyle. And the question of, you know, we're importing all this stuff, what is it? Why? Do we need it? Do we need to fly? Do we need to eat meat? And so on. And you'll know that there's a big debate about much of this. I thought I would show you this chart. There are various versions of this from different sources, and this is probably not the most accurate because there are more detailed country level data for the UK. But I found this a really shocking graph. The red line shows the UK, sorry, the blue line shows the territorial emissions. And I said we were reducing at 2.4% a year, and we seem to be doing fine. And when the government in the UK, remember I don't represent the government, talks about this, these are the numbers you get. But look at this one, this is the footprint. And if you compare 1990, which was the base year for all these calculations, with the latest year for which we have data here, our footprint in the UK has not fallen by 1 tonne in all that time. Why? Because we're importing more stuff. Why are we importing more stuff? There are 3 reasons. The first is we have deindustrialization, so some of the industries have moved offshore. The second reason is that there are more of us, because population continues to increase, of course more slowly here than in some other countries, I mean in the UK than in some other countries. And thirdly, income has risen. When you build growth into the system, it's inevitable that consumption tends to rise with it, and that has a carbon cost. And remember the graph I showed you right at the beginning, which shows the contribution that GDP growth makes to the overall carbon emissions. So my goodness, the footprint is a problem. And the question is what to do about that. There's a big literature. This is not, of course, to be read, but it's a picture of the communique from the UN Secretary General Summit in September. And an interesting thing, lots of countries committing to zero carbon by 2050, although not enough and not necessarily the big ones. France saying they will not sign a trade agreement with any country which does not meet environmental standards. That is principally today targeted at the Brazilian government because of the Amazon. But in Europe, at least, a lot of people are talking about border carbon adjustments, border taxes on countries that use coal or that don't have sufficiently progressive climate policies. And I think for developing countries which have export-led models of growth as part of their strategy, this is going to be a very serious issue for the future. Are you going to be able to export to countries which are imposing strong carbon restrictions on the content of imports? And of course, we're going to be changing our diet, eating less meat, eating a lot less dairy, and that has also trade implications. Where is the global analysis, for example, of what changes in diet are going to do to land use, to prices, to market opportunities? You know, if you buy a cup of coffee from a coffee shop in a cup in London, you've got the plastic cup, you've got the coffee which comes from Brazil or somewhere, Colombia, you've got the hot water, you put in a dash of milk and you put the lid on. What's the worst single thing for the environment in that cup of coffee? The answer is the splash of milk. And I mention that because I know that there are some countries where dairy plays a very important part in the diet. In most countries, dairy is a major contributor to climate change and a major focus of people who want us to change our diet. Of course, we're all going to go on bicycles. I've finished in 1 minute. So finally, a lot of debate in the UK that I thought I would mention, and in the US also, about the New Deal and the Green New Deal. People are competing in our election in the UK about when the zero target should be. Should it be 2025, as the Extinction Rebellion want, or 2030, or 2050? Is it gross or net? How do you manage the difference between gross and net through emissions, reductions and so on? And everyone's talking about the global Green New Deal, including Alexandria AOC in the States, the Labour Party in the UK, Joe Stiglitz in the top right-hand corner there. And one of the projects I would like us to think about together is whether we can't say something about a global Green New Deal, which is a partnership between countries like India and the UK. Those are just two books. What I've learned is the word Green New Deal is used to cover almost everything. You know, you say, I'm good, I'm a good person, I want a global Green New Deal, and then you throw into the pot almost everything you want to do. And if you compare the Americans and the British, they're very different. Finally, we're all moving, this is the last slide, towards COP, which is going to be in the UK next year, and that will be the point to which these 2020 pledges have to be made. I haven't spoken about India at all, but I'm very curious to know, Chair, what does India want? What does India expect? What does India need from these negotiations and the NDCs? And on the other side of the coin, what can the world expect of India in 2020 that will help us to solve the acute, urgent, political, technical problem that the emissions gap report has shown exists?
Thank you, Dr. Maxwell, for a very comprehensive presentation, which delves into different dimensions of the report. Dr. Maxwell has touched upon a number of issues. Of course, the key challenge is how do we decarbonize in the long term? What are the lessons from this kind of report which presents the gap in terms of the actions that we are taking today and the degree and the scale of actions which are required to meet the global ambition. Now, this is a challenging task indeed. The climate negotiating process so far has not been able to address this, and the primary reason of course is, as Dr. Maxwell also has touched upon this, is the development constraint which many countries are facing. It's important to understand this interface between the development and the climate change. When we talk of climate change, it's not enough to talk only about emissions. He himself talked about the likely impact of extreme weather events. This is an issue which has always agitated the policymakers, the climate negotiators, but somehow has not been able to address this fundamental question. Part of the reason is perhaps the scientists feel a little diffident in quantifying something which where the data is either very limited or because we have never understood the kind of impacts which can occur, as some of the statisticians or the economists call it the concept of stationarity. Since we have not seen what has happened in this, we have not seen the kind of impacts which can take place. We are not able to take it into account in our policy domain and also quantify the total impacts. But it will definitely be a challenge, and we will need to see how this report and its findings can goad the policymakers at the national level into further actions. Atul, at this stage, I would like to recognize the presence of the country director of UNEP, Mr. Atul Bagai, and it is with his support that this report is being discussed here. So
I'm sorry, I really need to leave. I didn't want to leave this place, but thanks to the panel for all this.
We were expecting your comments.
I think Simon has given those.
All right. Thank you very much. So to address this second question, what is the interface between the climate change and the development? I have two panelists here from RIS. Now, because of not only because we have a carbon constraint, we also have a time constraint. We have two speakers, and I'll request them to divide the time between the two of them, the total time of 15 minutes, and address this particular issue.
Thank you, Rashmi. I think the first thing which we need to address is the definition of development. And luckily, SDGs, they bring in the factor of inclusiveness and sustainability. So what we used to call as development, GDP or GNP, blah, blah. And today when we saw that slide from Simon on the UK, that shows how GDP vis-a-vis GNP can be very, very different. The GNP is having a large footprint, but GDP looks very, very nice, kind of something very nice. Yesterday morning, I was doing some calculations on Excel that if one moves by Apollo 11 that landed on the moon, in how many years one will reach the nearest star, Alpha Centauri? More than 1 lakh years, more than 100,000 years. So we don't have any plan B as of now, and we need to work on plan A only to do something with this planet. Now, it's not, I don't want to paint a very gloomy picture. To be very frank, on the side of the ozone hole, which is also a very important indicator, unfortunately, in the SDG global indicators, this is not included. In fact, the global indicators don't include something which is global. Temperature rise is not there. Sea level rise is not there. Ozone hole size is not there. But the good news is that it is the smallest in size since NASA started measuring it in 1982. Well, there are issues. It's better to wait for a year, but at the same time, it's heartening that it has come down in size. Of course, what we call as an ozone hole is something which, if you bring down all the ozone to the ground level at 1 atmospheric pressure at 0 degrees centigrade, it is just 2.2 millimeters thick. If if it is more than 2.2 millimeters, we say there is no ozone hole over there. Now, due to paucity of time, I'll touch upon some limited number of points. One is when we are talking in terms of Earth, and when we were doing this exercise on indicators in RIS, we wrote a paper. I wrote with Mr. Krishna Kumar, who's from Indian Statistical Service. We had taken greenhouse gases as one of the important parameters. But beyond the land, if we talk of taking out so much of cobalt from the sea or so much of minerals from the sea, we need to also have a look at the acidification of seas. We cannot now, having spoiled the land, we cannot just start spoiling the sea also. A question comes that if for livelihood, what should one do? What does the development say? If it says don't do this thing, don't do that thing, how will 7 billion people survive? My answer is, it emanates from economics that yes, there are methods. For example, if I were to establish a, say, paper manufacturing mill somewhere on a river in northern India, if I give fishing rights, if I get water rights on the downstream for next 100 kilometers to the same company, and which comes through, say, L1 process properly selected, then that company will have an economic stake in it. So I'm not saying that we just, there are ways, taxation and subsidy are tools of public policy, but there are better tools in economics which can be utilized. For example, I come down to say the issue of parali burning, which is a very hot issue, literally hot. So the approximate advices are that they should not do, or we give a subsidy, fine. But I think there are underlying causes also on that, and say too much of paddy coming from Punjab. The underlying causes are that we sitting over here, we are not consuming even 5% in our diet coming from coarse cereals. And Government of India giving so much of money for production of jowar and bajra, and we not eating. So we are forcing the hand, and then FCI not procuring these crops in spite of there being an MSP. Definition of MSP says that you have to, but it is not. So if these underlying factors are taken into account, things can become far better. I'll touch upon just one more point or two more points. One is I was seeing these reports from I juxtaposed 2015 report with 2018. Now 19 has come. These figures keep on changing, but they are becoming worse and worse. So when we play cricket, there is a term called asking rate. So our asking rate is going up and up and up, and we are approaching 2030. So something concrete needs to be done. I totally agree with this. And Dubash has also written in his book, quoting Schumpeter. There was some talk somewhere, not today, on these issues on Lorentz curve. Per capita emissions, we arrange all the countries in ascending order. But I would like to put a word of warning that this Gini coefficient is like Gini coming out of bottle. If theoretically the lowest, say LDC countries on the emission front, they increase their emissions, say, by 10%. And the top countries, they increase only by 1%. So all are increasing, but Gini will come down. So we have to be very careful when we are electing or selecting any parameter, which way it is operating. Lastly, I feel that, say, Sikkim has become an organic state. I see from the angle of farmers, one practical way could be, what is the carbon credit which is being given to farmers from Sikkim today? I'm not talking about other farmers. There's a lot being done across the country. So I think these are the issues, and with the paucity of time, I'm just raising these issues, these ways out, so that we can move forward and we can make development economics really development-related economics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anand. Thank you very much for sticking to the time. And you have raised a number of points which are extremely important. Now I'll request Dr. Sabyasachi Saha, who is also from RIS, in his presentation, and I'll request him to be economical with his time.
So, good evening. Happy to be joining both from RIS. Our words of welcome to all of you and, that you have joined this evening, and happy to be doing this with CPR and Terry. As Dr. Anand has already mentioned, I also bring some insights from SDGs to the table because that some way captures the dilemma that we have before us today in terms of climate change vis-a-vis development. And as Mr. Maxwell towards the end of his presentation was pointing out, sir, urging for or something that sort of a new deal that may be required at this stage. So I don't know whether SDGs were a new deal. We thought it were a new deal some years back, and that's the worry, because what we are talking today in terms of climate change may be seen at four broad levels, possibly at the level of the paradigm, at the level of the means, then the kinds of instruments that we have. And what SDGs have done today is to add one more layer where monitoring becomes important, and this is the layer of the indicators. While the climate change negotiations on the one hand have some teeth in terms of getting the commitments extracted out of countries, SDGs are by and large voluntary within the flexible domestic policy space. But what comes as a sort of commitment is on the indicators. And when it comes to SDGs, if I may say so, these are things that are contributing to climate change. So there are goals on one hand that contribute to climate change, the others that get affected. But on a lighter note, it cannot get more unluckier than on climate change than in SDGs, because they have assigned number 13 to climate change. So having said that, when we anchor, we say sustainability in terms of consumption, production, transformation that is required. Climate change goal 13 is about mitigation, what countries should be doing in terms of disaster resilience, raising money for that, and other issues. What is extremely important and neglected globally is goal 14. And Mr. Maxwell has pointed by giving his example of coffee, how diet has overall footprint across the globe. So SDG 14 becomes SDG 12 becomes so very important in this. So when we discuss SDGs and climate change, so both of these should be taken together. When it comes to the paradigm, as I was mentioning a little while ago, we broadly thought paradigm gets settled at the level of politics. And politics, if we think as a reflection of societal perceptions, we thought that paradigm is well settled. 2015, we thought the paradigm is fixed because we had the Addis Ababa Action Agenda launched that year, we had the UN SDGs launched that year, and ending with COP and the Paris Agreement. We thought, but 4 years down the line, we think that again we are going back to the paradigm, because we know in the intervening period, lot has where we have got unsettled with the paradigm itself. Unless we get the paradigm right, when it comes down to means and instrument, we are totally confused. Technocrats and economists can go on arguing on the instruments. Finally, my last point would be, again, hovering around one such instrument, where there is by and large some sort of agreement globally, is about the use of science, technology, innovation for SDGs, and climate change features very prominently in the whole agenda. The mechanisms are weak, the financing is even weaker. But let us also go back to what we have in terms of the social capital of negotiations, and it may not necessarily draw from what we see in climate change, but also when we discuss biodiversity, when we discuss public health, and the common thread is that the constraints around us is about the constraints that come from the non-harmonious policy regimes and sectors in a variety of fields. So this is something that needs to be taken in totality. We cannot just be discussing climate change and development, and within development, developing countries, and developing countries are of all shades and nature. Finally, is what again Mr. Maxwell pointed out briefly again towards the end about the convergence of policy parameters that we say had it been the age of classical economists, we would have said land, labor, and capital. Today we say trade, investment finance, and I would add technology to it. So how do we harmonize our objectives in this? So that would be very crucial. This has been very, on the face, the kind of revelations that this report is making. And in the entire process, I want to leave a note of, optimism, where we see that developing countries are providing some sort of leadership. Because, for example, in India, we have never considered sustainability to be something that is an add-on to the policy framework. We have been trying to incorporate it part of it, but challenges are large, that is for sure. But in the process, we definitely think that developing countries are need a policy and a conducive global policy regime that enables them to catch up with some of the commitments that have already made. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Sahab. You must have noticed he talked about the convergence of the SDGs and the climate goals, and noted that climate change is an unlucky goal. Somehow, and he's right in a way, in the sense that we haven't been able to achieve this goal. And part of the reason could be because this has not been ingrained in the development policies that we have followed so far. The challenge is to modulate these policies in such a manner that they serve all the other goals while also meeting the climate goals. It's an extremely difficult task. It's not easy. And the trick lies in trying to balance the emission goals with the goals of development and adaptation. No policy is fractured. And then the reason why we have had the Paris Agreement was because the national efforts were recognized. A bottom-up paradigm of bottom-up effort was recognized. And Dr. Saha talked about getting the paradigm right. So if we get the paradigm right, we might be able to get a good deal. We had a deal in Paris. What is the kind of new deal that we will be getting in 2020 or beyond depends on how we are able to balance these goals. This takes us to the third dimension of our discussion today, and then Dr. Dubash will touch upon that. He, as you know, he has, I don't have to introduce him and read out his CV, that is there in the public domain, but his contributions to the understanding of climate science and promoting the climate discourse in India is immense. I must thank him for the deep and the depth and the passion with which he approaches these issues, and he has been able to take them forward. And today's event is also an example of his commitment to this cause. I would request him to, in his presentation, to touch upon what the report means for India and how it will engage with the climate discourse in India. Mr. Maxwell did touch upon what he expects India to do in the light of this emissions gap. I hope you will be able to do justice to this particular dimension.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rashmi, and thank you to the rest of the panelists for setting the stage. Thank you, Simon, for being here and being part of this conversation, and Dr. Anand and Sabyasachi Saha for joining us as well. Mr. Rashmi was very kind in his introduction. I guess sort of his persistence gets its reward. Then, I have been banging away at this conversation for a while, and it's lots of familiar friends in the room. So I look forward to the conversation that follows. I am going to try and take my cue from Dr. Maxwell, move very quickly beyond the report, but I'm going to start at the same place that he did. I'm going to be very quick with this slide because much of it repeats what he said, but I think it's worth sort of underscoring, and we constructed these slides separately, so I'm curious to see how much overlap there is in our interpretation of some of the main takeaway messages. So I think, first of all, just very quickly on these, especially the overlaps, I think the fact that we are still looking at a 1.5% a year increase in emissions over the last decade on average is really distressing. after we have had, since, if you start counting in 1990, almost 30 years of efforts to limit greenhouse gas emissions. The fact that delay makes the task much harder. I think Dr. Maxwell talked about consumption emissions and emphasized that, so I won't go into that too much. In terms of the Paris Pledge, what the report says is that India is projected to comply by around 15%. Now, I just sort of put that number out there. How much do we sort of put faith in that number? How do we interpret that number? And similarly for other countries, I think is something that's worth coming back to and that I will touch on a little bit later in the presentation. I think one of the interesting political narratives that has emerged is from the Climate Action Summit is this idea of calling on countries to come up with a net zero target. By when will you become net zero? And that's a very interesting formulation. So far, we've seen a number of countries stepping forward, but they tend to be smaller countries. They tend to talk about these goals into the distant future, and they tend to have uncertain plans. So it's an interesting new narrative that has emerged, but I don't think we have actually seen this narrative sort of being translated into something with a great deal of bite just yet. The report and subsequent emission gap reports over the last few years, and I think I've been at this for much less time than Simon has. I've been doing this, I think, 4 or 5 years, and I think Simon's been here since the beginning, so 10 years or so of the gap reports. Co-benefits are a very big theme in subsequent gap reports. So this is the way to bring together the development and climate objectives. And this year, there's a particular focus on looking at big structural transitions. What are the big changes that we can bring about? Because if we are going to edge towards 3% per year, let alone 7% per year rate of decline, these need to be structural changes in the nature of the economy. So the gap report is important because it does carry these messages year after year. And it's become sort of a point on the calendar just before the climate negotiations in November or December to try and underscore where we are. Now, this said, having been part of the advisory committee, and I should stress that our role in the advisory committee, at least the way I have interpreted it, is to be to try and ensure factual correctness and so on and so forth, but also to be provocative, to try and sort of, and I've taken my cue from Simon Maxwell on that, asking questions. How do you make this report stimulate bigger questions and broader dialogues? And the consumption emissions part, in particular, is something that I think Simon has been very successful in giving prominence to in the context of the report. So here are my sort of, stepping now, in a sense, out of the emissions gap role and saying here are the kinds of things that the gap report is beginning to engage with and that I wish it would engage with a little bit more. So, and this is not by way of criticism, this is by way of how do we sort of delve deeper into the report and try and provoke a more, ever more robust conversation. So one formulation is that having something concrete like a gap and a number, 15 gigatons, 30 gigatons, makes things very concrete. It sends signals of urgency. But as time has gone on, the gap report is faced with a bit of a challenge, which Simon alluded to. The target has become more stringent, from a 2-degree target back in 2010 to a well below 2-degree target. And we have seen now a decade of delayed action. And so the gap has become bigger and bigger. And if you take seriously the 1.5-degree gap, it is 7% a year decline, which we have not seen from any country, not even leader countries. So what is so it's a tension for the gap report, putting out numbers that are likely to be infeasible, especially when you put together technology, institutions, and politics. What then is the message that one sends? Tied to this, there's been sort of a lot of debates within the process on how explicitly one should take on the burden sharing issue. So the models that the gap report rests on are based on these least cost models that actually set aside the question of how you will share the burden between countries or across countries on actually traversing that least cost path. There's been periodic conversation about bringing that back up. But really, the decision has been, that's not something that the gap report can sort out. It is really a question for sovereign nations to negotiate. And I think that's a fair point. But it does leave unanswered these questions of, if we are to go on this trajectory, who does what, and if the sum total adds up to less than is required by science, which is what happens with the Paris Pledge, then what is the mechanism to actually accelerate in ways that address questions about fairness and equity and so on. The third point is, in order to try and understand in a global way where countries are and what their pledges add up to, there is resort to national models, but also comparable national models. And those national models, in order to come up with very simple answers about is your current policy trajectory, what are your likely emissions 15 years from now based on a current policy trajectory, it necessarily flattens the complexity of particular country context. And again, I'll come back to this in a minute. And there's a little bit of a risk that in order to get the kind of concreteness that the GAP report requires, you end up having to shave the edges off what are otherwise quite complex. And I would argue that actually it is precisely the complexity which is where the richness of the conversation lies, and that over time, it would be useful if the GAP report could move into opening the conversation within each country on how far we can go and with what consequences for development, which is sort of in a sense, where this conversation is really headed. So for the rest of the talk, I'm really going to focus on that second part of the question. So the GAP report, the first part of the GAP report is always the number, that complex diagram that Simon laid out, and sort of flagging the urgency of the situation. The second part begins to get grips with the complexity in particular sectors, but not in a country-by-country way. And I think that actually, if you read the report as an encouragement for every country to have that conversation in a national context, that is a very good reading and use of the report. So let me just now take a few more minutes to go through the story through an India lens. The first comes back to the models question. Now, this somewhat complicated slide is our effort at CPR to put down. This was done pre-Paris, and I've sort of, when Mr. Rashmi was in the government, I used to show up regularly at his office with this slide. So he's seen it on a number of occasions. This was our effort to summarize the projections of different studies and different scenarios within studies for where India would be in 2030. Let me take a page from Simon's book and use my finger as a pointer. I forgot to bring my pointer, my apologies. So along the bottom here are different GDP growth rates, because the different models assume different GDP growth rates or generate different GDP growth rates. This is all for 2030. This is one point in time. Along that axis is annual emissions, starting at 2, which is about what India had in 2012. So it's 100% as of 2012. So this is a multiple of the 2012 number. The tram lines over there are India's NDC, 33-35% below 2005 levels at different GDP rates. And the bubbles are different clusters of studies. Now the one I want to draw your eye to is this one. This yellow one is the projected emissions based on 2015 policies. The bigger purple one is projected emissions based on efforts at lower carbon development that were done in 2015, and the green one is ambitious low carbon development. So the point I want to make by showing this slide is that it's a real struggle for something like the GAP report, operating in a cross-country context, to say a country is or is not on track with its NDC. Because underneath the studies that it uses, which are typically globally comparative studies, there are probably a whole series of national studies that could give you any number you desire. That the country is dramatically out of whack, that it could potentially be far more ambitious than it is, or that it could actually, depending on effectiveness of policy implementation, vastly over-exceed its NDC. So when I see a picture like this, I find it hard to reconcile it with a statement that India will be 15% below. I just don't know, and I think that is also a best guess that we have to be a little bit cautious about. So I think the GAP report in the global aggregate tells us a very interesting story. I think in the nationally specific context, it should be used as an invitation to a national conversation, much more than as a statement of sort of gospel truth on where a particular country is. So so I think the interesting thing with a graph like this is to actually say under what conditions will you be in that green bubble versus the purple bubble versus the yellow bubble, and use that to have a conversation domestically. So bottom line, let's not get too carried away with the projections and predictions of these models, but let's use them as a way of having a conversation. Having decided that that's what we want to do, the question becomes, how do we have that conversation? And I would say the really productive way to have it, given the development context that our colleagues from RIS highlighted, is to focus on areas where we know things are changing dramatically anyway. We know that India is dramatically increasing its energy use. We know that it is urbanizing. How do we pick on some of these themes, some of these debates that are politically already alive in India, more than alive, and imbue them, in a sense, with a low-carbon conversation and understand what it means for development? So just pull out a few examples. So one example is energy demand. We know that it is highly likely that energy demand is growing in India a lot. So the slide in the top right basically shows Niti Aayog's projections. Again, I would take them a little bit with a pinch of salt, but you can see that demand is going to grow, according to this projection, tremendously between 2012 and 2047. And it might grow a fair bit less, about a quarter less, if we move to an energy efficient, that's what the EE stands for, an energy efficient scenario. We know that the building sector is going to dramatically increase. There's one of these sort of mythological numbers that always gets thrown out in Indian policy debates, that 2/3 of India's building stock is yet to be built. And I often wonder about that, but everybody repeats it, so I will. But we also know that industrial demand will continue to dominate and is likely to rise. But again, how do we know this, right? How do we know that? Do we have a clear sense that we know that India needs a lot more jobs. Do we really know that it will happen through the industrialization route in a time of greater mechanization, in a time of sort of rapid changes in IT, at a time when we have, when the global trade arena and regime is under threat? So those numbers assume a lot of things globally that we're just kind of taking for granted. So we need to have a conversation about that. We need to understand what is our jobs future under different global and national scenarios, and not just take as gospel these numbers. But it's not a conversation we're having, to be perfectly honest. We sort of talk about Make in India and kind of leave it at that. But I don't think we're unpacking it in a fine-grained way, and certainly not unpacking it in a way that brings together environmental conversations, not just climate change, but air, water, and so on. But what we do know is that energy efficiency gives you a very, very big bang for the buck in India. The reason for that is our energy supply infrastructure is very, very leaky. So if you look at the bottom right panel, compare the US world average and India, for every unit saved on the demand side in India, you save a lot more there as compared to other countries because of the leakiness of our energy system. So that's kind of an interesting message to take away as well. So energy efficiency really is the proverbial sort of rupee on the sidewalk. But how much can it bring down the size of each of those columns? I think that remains a question. But clearly, when we think about buildings, industry, and transport sectors, we need to be thinking about energy efficiency. So let me then sort of turn to transport a little bit more. So we know that India is urbanizing rapidly. We know we're sort of heading in the direction of 40-45% urban from something closer in the range of 25-30% urban. But if you look at the population density of say the United States versus India, and Europe would probably be a better comparison, you see that we already have a lot of people in very dense contexts. Now, obviously, this has implications for how we urbanize, how we manage something like transport. So I'm going to show you one of my favorite sort of visual slides. This is actually a slide of commutes in sort of a vertical stacked way. So Delhi compared to a few other major cities. And this is actually because the data are not from the same year, 2001 data for Delhi and 2007 data for London. And it's the number of commutes per day in different parts of Delhi. Now, in 2001, before we had a massive increase in four-wheelers and two-wheelers, that was the number of commutes per day in a tight urban space compared to, say, London or Tokyo. Can India feasibly build urban transportation around the private car or even around the private scooter? If we're going to double, effectively close to double our urban population, if we're already a few multiples above Western cities that are already that are viewed as quite congested, if we can't do this, and the arithmetic simply suggests we can't do this, are we thinking in a seriously transformative way about our transport systems and our urban planning? Because this isn't going to be a bit of tinkering at the margin, right? Another issue that doesn't permit tinkering at the margin is air pollution. Now, again, are we thinking in a really deep way? And of course, the subtext to all of this is, if we think in a very deep structural way about different transport systems, it is highly likely to come with a very different greenhouse gas emissions profile than if we think about it in a marginal way, right? So slightly increasing the automotive, the fuel efficiency of cars, slightly increasing the efficiency of fuels itself, as opposed to modal shifts, urban planning shifts, which could completely transform both our fuel use and our emissions profile. So let's take air pollution. Again, there are many ways of slicing up the air pollution problem, but what the graph to the left tells us, and this is actually a South Asia graph, the dotted line there is our safe standards, 40 micrograms per meter cubed. What it basically says that in North India, I'm going to have to pull out my glasses, but in North India, 98% of the population is above our safe levels, and in South India, it is 56%, right? So it's kind of a bimodal hump there, and a huge proportion of North India, as well as large parts of Bangladesh, Pakistan, and other countries, are way over multiple times the safe standard. And in order to address this, we have to address a whole bunch of different sources. And so it's a little bit different from, I don't know the China story that well, but in China you could go a very long way by dealing with coal. Whereas in India you have to deal with several different fuels and several different two more slides, Ms. Rashmi. Several different sources. So how are we going to do this? Well, one of the interesting things that we should do from that slide is both power plant-based coal as well as industrial coal. And if you look at power plant coal, we actually have standards in place, we're just not enforcing them. But this is a slide done by Professor Somnathan at ISI, which shows, now interestingly, this is the social cost of coal versus renewables, right? So the red line is the operating cost of coal. The black line is the actual cost of coal, excluding any climate costs. These are local costs, costs from air pollution, costs on health, and so on and so forth. And the blue and the green lines are different sort of cost bands for renewable energy. And what you can basically see is that most of your coal, if you look at the true cost, becomes uncompetitive relative to renewables once you factor in local pollutants. There is a really strong case purely on local pollutant grounds not to be doing much more coal and to be dramatically swerving away from a coal economy, right? So these are the kinds of transitions. Now that's easier said than done, but these are the kinds of big picture transitions that we're talking about. How do we get serious about the demand side across different use sectors? How do we get serious about the transport in the urban sector as well as intercity transport? How do we get serious about the coal transition? I'm going to skip this slide, but this is just to say we actually have this very interesting set of boxes in the government dealing with climate change. But most of the people in this box, if you look at the number of people, there are just 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people in each of these boxes. And the challenge really is, can you use climate change to pursue these conversations, to accelerate these conversations? We need an institutional structure through which to do that. So, if we look at the history of the climate debate in cartoons in India, back in 1991, the debate was global warming in an unequal world, this famous cartoon by Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan, the cover of their book. There's a peasant talking to presumably an American in a Cadillac, saying, "Yo, amigo, we need that tree to protect us from the greenhouse effect." Fast forward to the sort of the dawn of the co-benefits age, if you like, and you have the speaker saying, you know, a long list of things, much as I did, on renewables and energy efficiency and so on and so forth, and somebody in the audience says, what if it's all a hoax and we build a better world for nothing? You know, sort of the logic of the co-benefit story. And then, you know, I keep getting, so I've been most of my career in that sort of middle band, and I keep getting pushback from my colleagues, my younger colleagues at CPR, saying, you know, the time is past for this co-benefit stuff. And I note that the Hindustan Times yesterday had an op-ed where it says that they will no more talk about climate change, they will only talk about climate crisis. And I thought that was very interesting from a mainstream Indian paper. So it's a question in my head, and I leave it as a question in yours, and I would leave you then with just 3 questions. Do we need a more deliberate and strategic approach to key transitions as a way of dealing with climate change? Do we need a planning and strategic framework? So this is now that institutional box diagram. Is that inadequate for the task that we have? Do we need a structure where we have these conversations in a much more thoroughgoing way? And the third question is, our negotiation approach has really been about drawing a line between poor and rich countries and saying, you know, we have to think very hard before we step across that line. And I think the history of inequality and so on bears the wisdom of that point of view out. But we need a second arrow, if you like, to the quiver, which is India is a deeply vulnerable country. Are we taking that seriously enough when we figure out our negotiating strategy? So with that, I turn it back to Mr. Rashmi and look forward to the conversation.